Welcome to the Shepherd Mills, Inc. From alpaca to yak, the Shepherd's Mill creates an exquisite yarns and fabrics from the nation's finest natural fibers. If you desire marketable product from your own fiber-producing animals, artfully conscious created interior design or fashion products, or U.S.-sourced, U.S.-produced netting, weaving, or crochet yarn and hand spinners roving and other fine fiber arts supplies, we're here to help. If you have fiber to process at the Shepherd Mill, our goal is to provide you with a quality finished product that we will be happy using and proud to sell. As a producer, you may know exactly what you want. If so, we ask a few questions and do our best to meet your specifications.
What sets the Purina goat mineral and the Purina wind and rain sheep mineral apart from other minerals that are on the market is because they are designed by folks that are in the business. We work very hard at the Purina Animal Nutrition Center in Gray Summit, Missouri to maximize efficiency, to increase the number of lambs that we have on the ground, and I know the goat herds that we work with are on the same role as us. The best way for producers to ensure that they don't have a mineral deficiency is to supply a quality mineral. That's where we have worked so diligently on the Purina goat mineral and also the wind and rain sheep mineral to provide myself and other producers an opportunity to decrease problems. From the reproductive standpoint, vitamins and minerals play a huge role in sheep and goat. That's where we have found the biggest contribution to our operation in terms of AI and embryo and then conception on first-time service. So there's a distinct role that the minerals play in repro for us. That's what makes us unique and different, is because we're creating products that work for us.
Stay Tough Superior Fencing Products presents its fence test video. During this video, you'll witness the strength and resilience of a Stay Tough fixed knot fence compared to a standard hinge joint fence, as both are hit by a full-size truck. Stay Tough fence is made of high tensile wire that's 3 times stronger than low tensile wire and will stretch less than 1%. Low tensile wire will stretch more than 10%. Both fences were installed under identical circumstances and using the same tooling and fence design. Let's see the results. Stay Tough Fence comes with a 10-year written limited warranty. Contact us at 1-888-223-8322 or visit our website to find a dealer near you. Stay Tough Superior Fencing Products. Stay strong, stay tight, stay tough.
Although 2020 has been challenging for us all, it has also given us many reasons to be optimistic about the future of the American lamb industry. We are seeing significant increase in lamb consumption from both existing and new consumers, and like all of you in this essential industry, the employee owners at Superior Farms are working around the clock to meet the high demand for our products. And while supermarkets have seen a surge in the demand for lamb, our food service partners are finding creative new solutions to keep their businesses alive. Superior Farms is working with these loyal American lamb customers to develop new strategies and tactics to help them succeed in the months and years to come. Our goal remains to deliver a consistently great eating experience at a sustainable price for consumers and producers alike. Superior Farms is committed to working with every sector of the U.S. sheep industry to become more efficient and profitable, and we look forward to a safe and prosperous new year for all.
Making Kansas a better place to live and work has been our goal for over 100 years. It's a responsibility we don't take lightly.
Solids or sediment?
365 meters.
365 meters.
K-State Research and Extension serves our rural and urban neighbors by helping you adapt to new technologies, protect our environment, improve nutrition and food safety, and grow the next generation of leaders.
And my world. And my world.
We help farmers and ranchers adopt new tools that improve profitability in a rapidly changing marketplace.
That went into it, going to help some people.
We prepare and inspire leaders to take on challenges with confidence, be responsible, and give back.
Thank you very much. It will be a great help.
I think K-State Extension is a marvelous partner.
We bring people together to complement each other's unique strengths and make communities more vibrant and successful. We are Kansas State University, in every county, working shoulder to shoulder with organizations, local leaders, and you to help our state grow and thrive. We are K-State Research and Extension.
We're going to go ahead and get started now. And I'm Dwayne Craighead, Hodgman County Extension Ag Agent, and I'd like to welcome you tonight for our second session of the 1921 Western Kansas Sheep and Goat Virtual Conference. We had some small issues at our last week, but hopefully we have it worked out. Hopefully the technology works, and if someone gets kicked off, just rejoin and we'll get you admitted again. And last week I got kicked off, and so I had to rejoin and it worked out. So I know you missed me for a little bit. Keep your mics on mute. And if you turn off your video camera, it'll use less of your internet space. So it'll be the videos and stuff will come through a little easier. At some point next week, I'll send you the links so you can be able to re-watch the presentations. And also I'll be sending out evaluations. And with that, you'll be entered in. If you fill out everything, you'll be entered into drawing for some prizes, which we'll let you know what they are. Hopefully on Saturday, we'll get that figured out by then. So tonight we're going to be featuring our meat goat segment of our industry and our hair sheep segment. If you have any questions during the speaker's presentation, type it in the chat. I have Chris Long, Director and Agronomy Extension Agent at Walnut Creek Extension District. He's helping keep track of all of our questions, and he'll ask the speakers at the end of the presentation. Depending on time, we may have you have the ability and time for you to ask a question at the end of the segment. We'll just see how it works out as far as time-wise. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Justin's going to say something, and then he's got a video that we're going to play. So Justin Goodnow is our first speaker up. He's from Barber County Ag Agent, and he's a goat producer. So Justin.
Thanks, Dwayne. It's a privilege to be a part of the workshop. We started raising goats back around 2008. We run relatively small herd of goats. Our original emphasis was on the show weather industry, and our models kind of changed through the years. We still raise some show goats, but we also focus on breeding stock and then just some carcass goats as well. So I'll be on here all evening. If you got any questions afterwards, feel free to throw them in the chat. Thanks, Dwayne.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started on that video. I'll pull it up. And if I get the right buttons pushed here. All righty. Yep, hang on a second. Let me start over. Okay, share sound. Well, like I said, we're trying. Try this again.
With you today about some basic goat information. A lot of the stuff we're going to share could also be used for sheep as well. But when we're going through this, the pictures and the setups are at an actual goat operation. You know, before you get in the goat business, one of the things you need to ask yourself is why do you want goats? Or are you looking to get into the commercial business, which has been a strong market the last few years in that? Are you looking to do seed stock with registered boar goats? You're looking for pasture improvement or co-grazing systems where you can run goats with cattle or sheep, or is it a youth project? You got kids that are wanting to participate in some 4-H goat projects and get involved in livestock showing or just raising some. When we're talking about fencing and facilities, the thing I can tell you is you will enjoy the goat business as good as your fences are. If you're going to skimp on your fences or your facilities, you're probably not going to enjoy being in the goat business very long. When I first started looking at goats, you know, over 10 years ago, I had a guy share with me, and I think it's absolutely true. Once you've got your fences set the way you want them, go in the house and brew you a pot of coffee, pour your cup, go outside and throw that cup of coffee at your fence. And if it don't bounce back at you, pretty good chance your goats are going to get out. And you can talk to anybody in the goat business, and that story is true. Right here, we have a 6-strand barbed wire fence that a roll of field fence has been taken and rolled over the top of it and clipped up. My experience with goats is most of the time they're going to go through a fence or under a fence before they're going to go over it. Usually about the only time I've seen them jump fences is out of pure desperation. An example would be starvation. If they're starving where they're at, they will jump to get out. But most of the time they're just going to be browsing around. They're a very curious animal. And if they find a way to go through something or under it, they will do that over and over and over. This is a very effective fencing system in respects that they can't stick their heads through those little squares, and they're not going to stand on that fence because of the barbed wire. When we're looking at this was an existing pasture that had a 6-strand barbed wire fence, so we laid the field fence over it. You can easily roll that out with a bale bed. Just put you a 4-inch piece of pipe inside that roll and use your arms of your bale bed to squeeze that pipe, tie off on one end, drive to the other, and then give you a stretch off both ends to clip back to that barbed wire on. This stuff is very affordable, especially if it involves your kids and it's a 4-H project. You can get a discount at most major name brand farm stores, and this stuff can run you anywhere from $135 to $150 a roll. It's around I think 330 feet in a row, but a very effective fencing system. Right here, we got a 5-strand barbed wire fence. Every strand is hot. There's no goats in that pasture. During this picture, as you can tell, there's a clip missing on that bottom strand. But this is a very good option as well, and relatively inexpensive. This is barbless wire, so it's a little stouter. Like I said, every wire is hot, and you put a good charger on there with a good snap on it to get their attention. You can train them really quick to it. You know, the only trouble with this would be if you don't have a very good charger and it doesn't give them a good pop when they try it, it could send them on through, and then you'll have a very fun time trying to get them back in there. A couple other pictures here. On the left-hand side is this 6-strand barbed wire fence. Works great for cattle, not so much for goats. If you're in a large area, you may not have any issues with them wandering to the fence, but chances are that'll hold them no better than that cup of coffee you throw at it. On the right-hand side, it's just a set of runs with what we would call the sheep and goat panels. They're 4x4 square. You can get them about at any farm store. They are relatively expensive. So if you've got a smaller area, they work perfect for, like on these runs here. You can put bottle babies in there. You can use it as a sick pen or 4-H show projects. They work good for that. But if you've got a large area, it's going to cost you a small fortune to utilize those type of panels. On working facilities, that top left-hand picture, you're looking at a gate into a tub system. To the right-hand side of that is a race up into a chute. This has plenty of space to hold mature does. On the right-hand side, you can see it's got a swivel chute that you can put a squeeze on a goat if you need to. Get it up there about waist high to trim on hooves or do whatever type of doctoring you need. It's a relatively easy system to use. As you can see here in this video, this is a one-man operation. Just kind of use a little flag there to move the goats up the side of the alleyway into the tub, and then you can close the gate behind them and do whatever you need to do. When we're looking at birthing and the facilities for birthing, depending on what time of year you're going to be kidding or lambing, you need to be prepared. Goats are not cattle. They're very thin-hided. They hate water. So if you're going to be kidding in the winter months where there's going to be a chance of snow and whatnot, it's best to have a good facility where you can get them out of the weather and keep them dry. If you're going to be utilizing the fall or spring or summer months, your best option is let them be a goat, let them be a mother, and kid outside. If you are going to have to kid indoors or in a confined area, if they've never been in a kidding pen or a kidding jug, it's best to get them used to it prior to kidding, because it can blow their mind and they can forget to be mothers in a hurry when they're put in a confined area. But you can see here in the left-hand picture, this is a stall setup. Those stalls are about 5 foot wide, 5 to 6 foot wide, about 7 foot deep, and it gives a doe plenty of room to lay down, have babies in a comfortable environment, as you can see in that right-hand picture. Just keep in mind when you are using kidding pens, sometimes those does forget to be mothers, especially if you got some retired show does that's been spoiled all their life. They've become pets and they forget that they're goats. So be sure to keep some colostrum replacer on hand, not colostrum supplement. It needs to be colostrum replacer. That stuff is very effective if you've got a mother that, or a doe that forgets she's a mother. You can save one's life that way. You can see in this left-hand picture, This is one of my kids helping a baby get up underneath the mom to get it sucking. We're bottle feeding in one pitcher, and then we're tubing one in the other pitcher. Only help out if you need to. Let them be a goat. Let them be the mother they're supposed to be. But if they are absolute knotheads, you're going to have to get in and help them. And like I said, usually if it's a retired show doe that's been spoiled rotten all its life, you're probably going to spend some time in that pen with them. Once you got those kids up and going, a good idea, especially if it's in the colder months, is to have a warm box or a hot box where those babies can get out and or get away from their mothers and get into an area to stay warm. You know, if a goat's shivering, it ain't gaining. And the whole point of these is to get the gain on them as soon as possible and get them pedaled. This is a small little setup here, as you can see on the left-hand side. It's just enclosed with some plywood, got an old fertilizer tote cage on it that can be used for the babies to go through to get in there. That center picture, they're in there laying down perfectly comfortable during the colder months. And you can see in the right-hand picture, we've got some feeders in there as well, because this can double as a creep feeder. So this is just a little video what it looks like inside there. And these are very, very inexpensive to put together, and they are worth the time and worth the money. When we're looking at overall herd health and maintenance, I think one of the most important things, or two of the most important things, is body condition scoring and then parasite control. When we're looking at body condition scoring, it's a little different than cattle. It's a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the thinnest, 5 being the most obese. That ideal area is probably a 2.5 to 3. I'd prefer to have them around a 3. If they're bred does, you want to push that up probably around 3.5 to get them ready to be mothers and to milk for babies and whatnot. This is a little card that you can use as a guide when you are body condition scoring. It gives you some pictures to gauge by. We have these at the office. Just call anytime and we can get one to you. But when we're body condition scoring, there's a few things that we want to make sure we do. Starting in the top left and moving right. Want to run your hand down the top of that doe, down its spine, feeling to see how sharp that spine is, or how much condition there is as well. You want to get your hands on the loin area, over the ribs, and over that chest to get your score. And an example for me in a pinch is you can take your knuckles on your hand and you can run them across here, and that's about the feeling of a number 2 on body condition scoring. Then you move to the back of your hand, that's probably number 3. Then you get up here on the other side of your wrist, and that's probably more of a 4. So you can use that as a gauge if you need to in the pinch. When we're talking about deworming, the most cheapest and easiest way to check is doing a FAMACHA score on them. And what we're talking about is checking the color of that membrane inside the eyelid. What you see on the screen is a FAMACHA card. In order to get that, you got to go through a training to have that card. But it gives you a gauge of when you should deworm and when you shouldn't. What you would do is take your thumb, cover up that eyelid, and gently push against the eye as you roll your thumb down. If the hairs on that eyelid start to curl over your thumb, that's about where you need to be pushing. Don't push any harder than that. And then you would gently pull down that bottom eyelid, and it'll make those membranes pop. And then you can compare that color to the chart and determine whether you need to deworm or not. If you don't have a chart, just a quick field check could be using the color of the pigmentation under your thumbnail. That's usually around number 4 or 5 on the FAMACHA card, and that would give you a good indication if you needed to deworm or not.
Turn it down a little bit, please.
So Just some general maintenance, like when we're preparing for breeding season, most of the time we give everything a dose of LA200 just to knock any bug that may be in them out. We deworm if needed. We do that by checking eyelids, and we'll also spray for flies or treat for lice, whichever one is needed. We'll CD&T the bucks as well during this time. When we're finished working with the doe, we'll give a little spray paint dot on her back so we know which one we've worked. And then on the bucks, we'll use a little paint to put on their chest before we kick them out with the does. You can use a harness as well with a marker. I like the paint because you can catch them bucks. Just get you a glove on, rub it on there. Usually every 3 to 4 days or so, depending on how busy they are. And you don't have to worry about them getting a harness hung up on something if they're in a pen with a hay feeder or out in a pasture and there's tree limbs or anything like that. When we're looking at working babies, obviously you want to ear tag. We use a combination tag that's got a personal identification of the baby, as well as our farm identification for the Scrapie program. Those tags, you can get them from some of the name brand tag makers. They're relatively inexpensive, and they're a good quality tag. But we give a CD&T and then a booster. We also treat for respiratory and give that booster as well. And those are in conjunction with the CD&T. As you can see in the center picture, that's giving a CD&T shot under the skin. And then the far right is the respiratory. On these little babies, when you're doing that under the skin or sub-Q, 20 gauge half-inch needle works fantastic. If you get any bigger than that, it's really tough, especially on those thin-hided goats. Then we would fly spray them or treat for lice, whichever one's needed, and then check eyelids and deworm only the ones that are needed. One of my favorite parts of raising goats is they are Mother Nature's best conservation tool, in my opinion. As you can see in this picture here, these are some goats we took in to do some breeding for a guy, and the picture on the left, we kicked them into a little alleyway next to an arena, and it was plumb full of weeds and some crabgrass. There's a little bit of Bermuda grass in there. And 4 hours later, you can see the picture of the right where they have just completely smoked those weeds and left the crabgrass and the Bermuda grass. Here on the left, that is musk thistle. And if you get a good look at that, they have started chewing on that and eating it. We don't have to spray for musk thistle anymore. We don't have to dig it up. Our control of musk thistle is with goats. Once it blooms, they tear it up. And I mean, they take it all the way to the ground. On the right-hand side, you can see a cedar tree they've started working on from the ground up, and they'll do the same thing with that. They will take care of a cedar. On the left-hand side here, this is that same set of goats we've seen in that little alleyway with all the weeds. This is in a pasture setting. On the left-hand side, that's a doe standing in some very mature old world blue stem, which is considered an invasive weed. And this is past the point of where cattle wanted to graze it, and these goats went in there and started chewing it from the top down and helped control it. On the right-hand side, those goats are standing in what used to be a patch of Johnson grass. I don't encourage grazing or utilizing Johnson grass. It is a restricted noxious weed, but if the conditions are right, it is like ice cream to livestock, and those goats will take her down to the ground and allow your pasture, your preferred grass to take over. A nice little tool for lamb and goat marketing is this app for your iPhone. This is the Lamb and Goat Market Forecast. It's from Texas A&M, and I think maybe Angelo State as well. But you can download this onto your phone, and this gives you some really good information. As you can see on the left-hand screen, you can put in your weaning month for your goat, your weaning weight, and then you can hit that calculate button and it'll pop up the center screen, and that'll help project what your marginal revenue per head would be over the next 4 months. And that's a wonderful tool moving in to the sales season. On the right-hand side, if you was to click up on the tab that says current price, it would give you the market value of that day and give you a value of what they would be per head. A really good resource for selling market goats. So that wraps up this presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to help you anytime, and we wish you the best in the goat business.
All right, thanks, Justin. Does anyone, Chris, did anyone have any questions in the chat for Justin?
I have not seen anything pop up yet.
Okay, Justin, do you want to say anything else?
Not much other than the market's looking strong. We got good reports out of South Hutch, and it's a good time to be in the goat business.
All right, thanks, Justin.
Dwayne, we did have a couple questions that just popped up. First one here, at what age do you give the first CDNT and respiratory shot to the kids?
That's generally around 2 to 3 weeks old.
Okay. And another question here, a couple questions about that app. Do they have a similar app for Android devices? Thanks, put it out.
The last I knew, it was for iPhones only at this time.
Okay. And then the last question here that I've seen so far, what is that app called again?
It's just the sheep and goat market app through Texas A&M, or lamb and goat market forecast. You can find that in the apps on your iPhone that way.
All right, I think that's all we've got for now.
All right, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Justin. Next up, we have Susan Shanum, and I know I butchered it. It looks like she put the app in the chat there, but here she is, and she's getting ready to speak. So she's the Maryland sheep and goat specialist, and she's also has several Katahdins. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan. We've used her stuff in many of our presentations at our previous conferences, and she has a lot of information out there for us to use and is willing to share it. So thanks, Susan.
Thank you. And can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm from a very different place, but I can tell you that a lot of the information is going to be consistent. I want to thank Justin for his presentation. A lot of really good information. A little bit about me. I've been in extension for, it'll be almost 33 years in a couple of months. Started out as a county ag agent. Feel like I've been involved with the meat goat industry since its birth, or at least since it started to, really increase in this country. Started the Meat Goat Show at our state fair. I think we've had it for about 15 to 20 years now, but I'm the one that started it, was superintendent for a number of years. I work at a research center. The University of Maryland is located very close to Washington, D.C. Fortunately, I don't go down there very often. I work at a regional center that's up close to where the skinny part of Maryland is. Just kind of a brief remembrance of where Maryland is, it's in the middle of the East Coast. So we're right on the ocean, but we're a very diverse state, just not like Kansas, because Kansas is quite different, but we're diverse in our own way. So I'm in the mountainous part of the state. And we've been doing small ruminant research since 2004. For 11 years, we did a meat goat performance test. It was pasture-based, and so we focused a lot on internal parasites. We actually had several consigners from Kansas that supported our test. We've done a lot of carcass work with goats, an awful lot of carcass work. In fact, one of our studies, again, we got them from a producer in Kansas. So that was pretty neat. A couple of years ago, we transitioned to sheep research, trying to keep it even, do a little bit of goat and a little bit of sheep. So that's a little bit about me. I do have a small flock of Katahdins. I had meat goats in the past, don't have them right now. I have a small place, and maybe after I retire, I'll probably get back into some meat goats, because like Justin said, this is a great time to be in the meat goat industry or in the goat industry, whether it's dairy or meat, much like it's a good time to be in the sheep industry. Prices are really good. I live in a part of the country where of course, most goat meat goes into the ethnic market, but we have very unique stockyards and very unique marketing situation out here, and goat prices are always good. The greater challenge, I actually think, is production. You know, normally when we talk to people about getting into ag enterprises, we say, well, you need to look at your market first. Well, I'm not saying marketing's not important, but I've not seen bad goat prices in a very, very long time. Okay, so what I want to talk about, because I want to be real careful and not, tell you all the things that Justin told you, because he told you a lot of good information. So I want to take some different angles on talking about some, what I call goat basics, or just some general advice on raising goats. Probably emphasis a little bit more on the meat side, but a lot of it's equally applicable to the dairy goat side. So he did a really good job of talking about the kinds of facilities that you need for goats. And what I'd like to emphasize is things like not exceeding the resources that you have, matching those resources to the way that you raise goats, making sure you have a resource to deal with predators, and making sure that you have a way to gather and handle your goats, which again, he gave you some really good examples of that. So the first thing I want to talk about is not exceeding your resource limits. And our resources are our buildings, like housing and shelter, our mechanism from feeding, whether that's feed bunks or hay rings or hay feeders, our watering system, whether that's troughs or a pasture watering system or automatic waters in the barn, the labor that you have available, when do you have labor available, the quality or the expertise of that labor, and then obviously your pasture resource. How many acres do you have in pasture? How many do you have in browse? How many paddocks do you have? How is that fencing? Every time we overuse or go beyond one of those resources, we're asking for problems. When we overstock our pens and pastures, we get more disease issues. One of the primary causes of coccidia is overstocking. When we overstock pens, we need to bed them more. We always don't get that done. And so we've got a lot more animals in the same area. We have more respiratory problems. The primary cause of internal parasites is overgrazing, too many animals in that particular area. It's more complex than that, but certainly overgrazing is a major cause. Certainly doesn't do the forage any good either. When we don't have enough feeder space, we can have problems. Goats, as we know, their behavior is a lot stronger than some of the other herding animals, and a timid or older doe can easily be pushed out of the feeder. If you're mixing kids from different sizes and you don't have adequate feeder space, we can have problems. Not having enough space in terms of access to water, but also not having, frost-free water available, cool enough water in the summertime. Anything that reduces their water consumption can lead to problems. There's lots of causes of urinary calculi, but one of the causes is inadequate water consumption. And of course, if you don't have the labor available to take care of goats when they need it, we can have problems. We think of needing a lot of labor at the time of kidding, particularly if we're kidding indoors. But if you're grazing and you're grazing in a part of the state where you have high rainfall and a lot of worm problems, then you better have the labor to deal with checking those animals on a fairly regular basis during the grazing season. Now, there are space recommendations for housing, feeding, and watering for goats. And as a general guideline, you should follow them. In fact, you should consider providing additional space. If that says you need 25 square feet, well, maybe you should provide 35 square feet. You'll only do yourself a favor. You need to consider the effect that horns might have on space requirements. More feeder spaces is often needed, more loafing area is often needed when you have horned animals. When we look at our pasture, we don't want to ever allow goats to overgraze a pasture or even overgraze a browse area. That old adage of take half and leave half, that's good advice. We want to make sure we have sacrifice areas when we don't have enough forage and we feel like we want to keep grazing it. Well, it'd be better to put them in a sacrifice area. Personal opinion, for small ruminants, the best sacrifice area is a dry lot or some area where they can't do any grazing. Otherwise, sacrifice lots can be a really risky area for parasites. And you want to match your production system to when you have labor available. I make sure I lamb at a time of the year that works with my job with the university. And you have other things that you have to consider. If you're, a lot of times people do birthing in the wintertime because they're not involved in the field, and that's a good time to be taking care of the kids. You want to make sure you match your production system to your resources. There is no single or best way to raise goats. If somebody tells you the only way that goats should be raised on pasture, they're wrong. If they tell you the only way to raise goats is in dry lot or in a building, they're wrong. You can do it the way it works for you. Every farm has a unique set of resources. You need to design your production system around those resources. So if you have good buildings, you have ample labor, but you don't have a lot of pasture, or maybe it's not adequately fenced for goats. Justin did a good job talking about the fencing needs for goats. Well, if that's your situation, you're probably going to want to develop a more intensive production system that's going to involve more confinement and more feeding. If you have good facilities, you're going to be able to kid in inclement, specifically cold weather. If, on the other hand, you don't have a lot of facilities, you don't have a good barn, maybe you're limited on labor, but you have plenty of pasture, it's adequately fenced, then you're probably going to develop a pasture-based production system that utilizes fewer purchased inputs. But you're going to want to kid during mild weather. So you got to look at what you have and then create a production system that matches that. Not your philosophies, it needs to match your resources. Not that your ideas don't matter, but they won't work if you don't have the resources that support them. Under resources, I like to talk about predator control, because even if you've never had problems with predators, we always got to keep it in the back of my mind when we have sheep or goats. They are very vulnerable to predators, and you could raise them for 20 years and it would only take one attack that caused significant problems. Predator control is like parasite control. There's no one thing. It usually requires a combination of management options. Hopefully most of them are non-lethal, but sometimes we need to bring in the big guns and we need to use lethal methods. We need to eliminate those predators. Predator control starts with a good fence. Even if goats didn't need a good fence to stay in, we need a good fence to keep predators out. And of course, increasingly, livestock guardians are also seen as part of the solution. And there's a lot of other things that we can do to help control predators, but fencing and guardians is probably the most common. But as a goat producer, we just always need to keep it in the back of our minds. Even if we have a basically confinement system with outdoor lots, we still got to remember it's always a risk. Justin did a good job talking about a handling system. And I was watching the videos at the before we got started tonight. Handling systems vary considerably, both in how elaborate they are, as well as obviously their cost. But the bottom line is you need some method in which you can easily gather your goats and handle them. If you don't have an easy way to do that, important tasks often get delayed and sometimes they're not even done. For example, if you don't have an easy way to check your goats and you graze them during the summer and you're in a part of the state where parasites are a big problem, you're not going to probably FOMACHA score them often enough, and you may well end up with dead goats. So you need an easy way to do it. If you just have a couple of animals, you can hold them, you can use a halter, you can put them on a grooming stand or a milking stand. If you've got a small herd, usually all you need is a small pen. You run them into that small pen, they're close enough together, and they're easy to catch. When you get to have a larger herd, and large is a relative term, you have to decide when you need more elaborate facilities. But when you get a larger herd, you should have some corrals for gathering, catching, and working goats. Hopefully you'll have some sort of restraining device as well. These handling systems can be portable, such as the one in the middle. They can be more permanent, such as the one on the right. The first one, the one on the left, that's the handling system we use at our research center. We use the scale is on the platform. We have a head gate in that platform, and it works equally well for sheep and goats. Theoretically, that system can be moved around, but we pretty much keep it there permanently. And the second one, obviously you can see that's on wheels and that can be moved around. But the bottom line is you need a handling system for goats. And sometimes it varies, you know, depending on your production system. There's goats raised in Texas that the only time they are ever handled is when they're loaded on the truck to be taken to the sale barn. Same thing with the feral goats in Australia. That's the only time they're handled. But I think for most of us with smaller herds, we're going to be collecting them up and doing some things to them at certain times. And it's important to have a way to do that. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about breeds. And I'm going to focus mostly on meat goats because I think the situation is different when you're talking about fiber goats or dairy goats. But with meat goats, I think sometimes we focus too much on breeds. I think health and performance are much more important than buying a breed. We want to make sure we don't start our goat operation with unhealthy animals or animals that are carrying hidden diseases. Sometimes it's hard to see diseases when you just look at them. We want to make sure if you have an established herd that you don't introduce diseases into your herd. When we look at the meat goat breeds genetically, there's as much difference within a breed as between breeds. There are boars out there that are resistant to internal parasites. There are Kikos out there that can grade selection 1. So there are differences within the different breeds. In most cases, crossbreds are definitely the way to go. I mean, I'd say, yeah, they're better. You know, unless I'm a seed stock producer that's selling full-blood boars or purebred Kikos, obviously you can't raise crossbreds, but for commercial meat goat production, crossbreds are definitely the way to go. There's 2 advantages to these crossbreds. One is breed complementarity. That's where basically we balance the strengths and weaknesses of the different breeds. And then hybrid vigor, and that's when the kid's performance is superior to the average of his parents. And hybrid vigor is especially advantageous for fitness traits, things like, you know, things that keep these animals alive. Another thing that's important, and Justin, I think, alluded a little bit to that. He was talking about how when you put a doe in a kidding pen for the first time, you know, how is she going to behave? So you do need animals, regardless of breed, that adapt to your production system. You know, if you're going to be intensive and they're going to be in smaller pens and in the barn, that's a very different goat than one that's seen a couple of times a year. So you're going to want to make sure your animals adapt to your production system and also adapt to your environment, to the climate, the conditions that they're going to be raised under. Switch over to animal health for a little bit. And this has to do both with animals that you start with or animals that you introduce to your herd. Most diseases walk through the gate. And so we have to be careful. You know, there's huge focus now, obviously, on diseases, on animal traceability and things like that. And we need to be concerned about it because this is going to have more to do with your profitability than probably just about anything else, is keeping some of these diseases out of your herd. Foot rot is probably the #1 disease to make sure you don't introduce to your herd. And that's primarily from a practicality standpoint. It's not like it's the worst disease, it's just the most common one. You don't get foot rot by not trimming feet, you get foot rot usually by buying it. The other one you hear a lot about is CL, which are the abscesses. You can see a picture in the upper right of a goat with a probable CL abscess. We can get either under the skin abscesses, which is more common with goats, or we can get internal abscesses, which is more common with sheep. It's not curable. It's one of the diseases that can kind of cause a wasting away. It is contagious. We don't want to introduce it. CAE is, you see dairy goats focus on that disease a lot more. To me, what's tough about this disease is it affects, it's kind of like COVID, it affects multiple systems in the body. It can, everything from arthritis to encephalitis to hardback mastitis. It's also untreatable. Sore mouth and pink eye are diseases that are usually, you know, they tend to go away, but they also can tend to get established in your herd. Sore mouth is of particular concern because it's zoonotic, which means people can get it. It usually isn't a huge problem, but it can occur at the wrong time. It can occur during kidding. It can kind of potentially cause mastitis or get some young kids really down in health and condition. It can occur right before the fair, you know, so it's a timing thing. Pink eye, to me, what's of greater concern with pink eye, it's not zoonotic, but it can, depending on what the cause of it is, it can introduce other concerns like chlamydia can cause pink eye, but it's also can cause abortion, mycoplasma. So there's some things that can concern us. Johne's disease is a fatal gastrointestinal disease. Again, it's one of those things that might cause an animal just to go down and you treat it and nothing happens and it just sort of wastes away. Q fever is primarily concerned because it's a zoonotic disease. Increasingly, universities are putting restrictions on researchers and trying to make them only use animals that don't have antibodies to Q fever. Scrapie is very uncommon in goats, but it's very important from a regulatory standpoint, you know, trying to eradicate this disease from the US. We want to make sure all of our goats have official Scrapie ID, whether the ones we are raising or ones that we have purchased. While we're talking about health, I want to talk about dewormers. As producers, as educators, as veterinarians, we need to accept the fact that dewormer resistance is real. The worms have developed resistance to all of the dewormers and all the dewormer classes. So there's basically 3 classes of dewormers that we have in the US for goats and sheep. They have developed resistance to all of those and thus all of the drugs within those groups. And it's a genetic trait that the worm passes on to its offspring. So obviously, as we keep selecting for it, it gets worse. So resistance is a fact, it is not an opinion. However, the level of resistance varies by geographic area and farm. It makes perfect sense that resistance is higher in areas that have had to deworm more frequently. So think about the Southeast, Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, raising goats in those climates where worms are practically a problem year-round. They're very humid climates. They've had to deworm more frequently, so consequently their resistance levels is very high, and in some cases there's farms that have absolutely no effective dewormers. In a state like Kansas, it's a diverse state. Obviously, your rainfall varies significantly from one part of the state to the other. You would expect resistance levels in Kansas to be lower than Maryland, just like Maryland is lower than Louisiana. But you would expect perhaps in the wetter part of the state where goats have had to be dewormed more frequently that resistance might be higher. But it does vary by individual farm. You know, if you have a farm that's like hardly dewormed anything in 20 years, you might expect to have some pretty good efficacy with the dewormers on that farm. Conversely, you could have a farm that dewormed a lot and didn't even necessarily need to, but did it, and they could have relatively high levels of resistance. The way you determine resistance is to do before and after fecal A counts on about 15 animals per dewormer. If you do a before and after fecal A count, like on 1 or 2 goats, that'll tell you whether the treatment was effective. It won't tell you anything about resistance. So we recommend that all farms test for resistance now. And you wouldn't have to do all drugs at one time. You could just do the 15 animals at a time. And resistance to drugs, including antibiotics, is inevitable. The first time a product is used, 0.00001 of that organism may survive, and that's the start of resistance. So we didn't cause resistance, but we control the rate at which it develops. So we can do things that can slow it down. It's too late in the Southeast, pretty much. But in Kansas, it's definitely not too late because you probably have a lot of farms where the dewormers still have some efficacy. So how do you delay dewormer resistance? So we want the dewormers to keep working in Kansas. The first thing we do, just plain and simple, is we need to deworm less often. We have a term or a concept we call targeted selective treatment or non-treatment. So deciding which animals need dewormed, and just as importantly, which animals do not require deworming. Justin mentioned the FAMACHA system. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The 5-point check, which is looking at 5 different places on the animal's body. Performance, things like average daily gain, using some sort of criteria to make a decision to deworm. Don't deworm based on the calendar, and don't deworm because you haven't done it lately. Deworm because they need it. We need to deliver all dewormers orally over the tongue with an oral dosing syringe. You can't really see it in that picture, but that's what we're using here, a small flock drencher, or an automatic drench gun, okay? We want to make sure the equipment is properly calibrated in both cases. Very important not to underdose. That's probably the second cause of dewormer resistance after deworming too much. We need to make sure we deworm based on an accurate weight. If you don't have a scale, you should have a scale, but it gets back to that, how big of an operation do you need before you can justify the cost of a scale? If you don't have a scale, you can use weigh tapes. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And always remember that goats metabolize dewormers more quickly. They clear their system more quickly, so they require higher doses of the dewormers as compared to cattle and sheep. So usually 1.5 to 2 times the cattle or sheep dose. The 1.5 is for prohibit or levamisole because it has the lowest safety margin, and the 2.5 is for the rest of them. It's now recommended that we give a clinically parasitized animal a combination treatment. The combination treatment is when I give a dewormer from each dewormer class sequentially, one after the other. I don't mix them, I have them in a different syringe. That would be the most potent dewormer from each dewormer class. That would be valbazen, cydectin, and prohibit. Combination treatment is extra label for drugs. That VX, if you see that in my presentation, that means a veterinarian should be involved. We want to make sure we store our dewormers properly and don't use significantly expired products. A product that's lost efficacy because of storage or age may still treat that animal, but it is going to promote resistance, or it's going to lead to resistance quicker. While we're talking about worms, I want to talk a little bit about coccidia. I think we have kind of two evils in small ruminants in terms of parasites. One is the barber pole worm, and the second one is coccidia. And coccidia can be a bigger problem than worms, especially in confinement or dry lot. It can be a problem on pasture, especially in real intensive grazing situations or pasture systems where the animals congregate around maybe shade or shelter or a feeder or water. But it's tends to be more of a confinement problem, which means it can almost be a year-round problem. Coccidia is host specific. Even goats and sheep don't share the same strains of coccidia. The main symptoms are like that goat in the middle. He just looks like crap. He's unthrifty, he's not thriving, and from his backside, you can see that he has had scours. Adult goats are mostly immune to coccidia, but they're carriers. And keep in mind, when fecal egg counts go up at the time of kidding, so do coccidia oocyst counts. So she becomes the primary source of infections. The dewormers are not effective against coccidia, and there are different drugs to treat versus prevent coccidia. None of the treatments are FDA approved for goats or sheep, which means they're extra label, and again, VX, they require a veterinarian. We prevent coccidia with good management. Things like making sure kids get enough colostrum, making sure the pens are clean and dry, making sure we don't mix animals of significantly different ages, making sure they don't have other diseases. You know, if a kid is compromised from a respiratory standpoint, is more likely to suffer from coccidia. And we can use coccidiostats strategically. We never want to use them year round because we have similar concerns with resistance. We can put coccidiostats in feed, mineral, milk, or water. Rumensin and Decox are both FDA approved for goats. So we do have some tools for preventing coccidiosis. We don't have the same medical preventions for worms. Dewormers are only for treatment. In coccidia, for coccidia, we have both treatments and products that can be used for prevention. But management is still the best option. Okay, still on animal health. It's important that we use medications legally. Whether we like it or not, the animal agriculture is coming under increased scrutiny. Consumers are becoming more concerned about how animals are raised and what is put into them. And with goats, we have some serious concerns. We have few dewormers that are labeled for goats. Only Safeguard and Morantel tartrate. That's the product that is sold as where you feed it. It's usually often labeled as goat dewormer or positive goat pellet, and you feed it. So those are the only approved dewormers, and they're only approved at specific dosages. And I can tell you Safeguard dosage is definitely not effective. So you have to increase the dosage and it still may not work. So we don't have really any FDA approved deworming options for goats, unlike sheep, where we have 4 dewormers in those 3 classes. If you go into a feed store and purchase a product over the counter, for example, Corid, that's used to treat coccidia. It's not labeled for goats, but you can buy it and you can probably use it, but technically you should be working through your veterinarian to use Corid. If we look at the common over-the-counter antibiotics that I can buy in the feed store, and that would basically be penicillin, LA200, or Tylenol. None of those antibiotics are approved for goats. The only one that's approved for sheep is penicillin, and we very often use those antibiotics for conditions for which they are not approved. So technically we're using them extra label, and technically we need a veterinarian. Most of the time when we need to treat for respiratory disease, it's already recommended that we use prescription antibiotics. Xanel was our preferred antibiotic when we did our buck test, and Nuflor is our preferred antibiotic in our sheep research. Both of those require a veterinarian to purchase. A lot of the other things we use to manage goats and sheep already require a veterinary prescription. Thiamine is not available over the counter. Thiamine, of course, is used to treat polio. Bosi, which is selenium, used to treat white muscle disease. That one's we have to get from a veterinarian. Oxytocin, which is a hormone, it's a muscle relaxant. We have to get that from the vet. Banamine, a non-steroid anti-inflammatory, and dexamethasone, a steroid anti-inflammatory. Those are already, we have to go to a vet to get them. A few years ago, they passed the veterinary feed directive, which requires that any antibiotic put in the feed has to have a veterinary script. And at the same time, antibiotics that were put in the water transitioned from over-the-counter to prescription. That's what the RX means. That was a significant thing for goats, because the preferred treatment for coccidia is usually to use a sulfa antibiotic, something like Dimethox or Alban. Putting it in the feed, that really wasn't done much with goats. The only antibiotic that's used in feed for sheep is to prevent abortions. But the transitioning of the Dimethox to prescription was significant to the sheep and goat industry. What's important to remember is that only a veterinarian has the legal right to use, actually I got grammar looks wrong there, to use or prescribe drugs extra label. So that's not something you as a producer legally can do. Practically, you can do it sometimes. You can, again, you can buy Corid and you can put it in the water. But technically, the vet should have told you to do that. The other thing to keep in mind, and I think many of you may be already aware of this, is the veterinary feed directive, which came into effect in January of 2017. That was the beginning. The goal is to really tighten the reins on using antibiotics. And so soon all antibiotics will be available via prescription only. So in the future, you will not be able to go into the feed store and purchase penicillin, LA200, or Tylenol. You will either have to go to your veterinarian to purchase those medications, or you will have to get your veterinarian to write a prescription so that you can go to a third party like Valley Vet to purchase those. And so when you consider extra label drug use and when you consider prescription drugs, all goat producers need to have a veterinarian. All goat producers need to have a veterinarian client-patient relationship. That's the term that is used. And I know that of having a veterinarian it can be a touchy subject, and I don't specifically know what your situation in Kansas is, but almost every place in the United States, we suffer from a shortage of small ruminant veterinarians, both ones that are willing to work with the animals as well as ones that have practical knowledge of our animals. But it actually doesn't matter. We're going to have to find a way to bridge that gap. There's 7 requirements to have a veterinary client-patient relationship, and you can see what they are. But the most significant is that the veterinarian has to either examine the animal or be personally acquainted with your farm by making timely farm visits. How often the vet would need to visit your farm, I think that's going to have a lot to do with the vet himself or herself. What is that vet is going to assume responsibility for using all those drugs? So what is he or she going to be comfortable with? Are they going to say an annual visit? Are they going to say, well, I need to come out twice a year? Those are things that you have to figure out. But if you don't already have a vet, you need to start making progress towards that so that you don't lose access to the medications that you need to manage your animals. Okay, going to shift gears a little bit and kind of give you, I guess this is sort of an opinion of mine, the 3 most important skills that I think you need to learn as a goat producer. And Justin, I'm not so certain, he talked about 2 of them, if not all 3 of them. So the first skill I tell everybody that they should have as a small ruminant producer is the ability to tube a lamb or kid. And tubing simply means we're gonna feed milk through an esophageal feeding tube, just like you see there in the picture. Because colostrum is definitely a limiting factor in the health and vigor of kids. There's a lot of money to be made in goats if you can get your does to produce, you can get 2 or 3 really good quality kids to market. And they have a good reproductive rate. So somewhere between being born and getting to the marketplace, we have too many problems. And colostrum is like the foundation of that health of that kid in the early part of his life. And in many cases, the kids aren't consuming adequate colostrum, especially the multiple births. And we want multiple births because that's how we make money. I can do simple math. If I multiply 2 or 3 times $200, I'm going to make a lot more money than 1 times $200. So we need to get colostrum in these kids. I appreciated what Justin said about making sure if you're not using your dose colostrum that you're using a colostrum replacer, not a supplement. You need to make sure you get those antibodies in those kids. Obviously, we always end up with some does that can't raise their kids. Maybe she's sick, maybe she dies, maybe she's got mastitis, and we need to raise those kids artificially. So tube feeding saves you time, but I think the most important thing tube feeding does is it makes sure that that kid gets adequate colostrum. I may mess around for an hour trying to get 2 ounces of colostrum into a kid through a bottle, but if I tube it, I can get it in there pretty fast and I can guarantee that he got it. And it doesn't take, it's not that hard to do. I mean, you know, it's a little scary the first time. In the lower left corner, there's a good fact sheet, a really good fact sheet that walks you through it. There's also YouTube videos that you can look at. Be careful about the YouTube videos, consider the source. I would make sure I looked at one. Premier has a good video. Also, you'll see some done by vets to make sure you're doing it right. And there can be some differences in how it's done, but there's some basic things that you need to do. And it's something I think that's really important, saves time, can save kids. So I would definitely consider this an important skill. The next skill I think that's important, and Justin talked about it, was FAMACHA scoring. So if you live in an area where you get sufficient rainfall and barber pole worm is a problem, FAMACHA is definitely something you want to learn. And even if you live in a dry part of the state, if your pastures are irrigated or at times when you get rainfall, you can still have a problem. And so the FAMACHA system was developed in South Africa to address the dewormer resistance issue. Because in the old days, we just dewormed everybody. It was easy, the drugs worked, they were relatively inexpensive. But because we have such huge resistance issues, we've had to find a way to not deworm everybody and deworm animals that need it. So the FAMACHA system is a decision-making tool for deworming. It only works with the barber pole worm or any parasite that's a bloodsucker. The only other parasites that's a bloodsucker would be liver flukes. And so they're actually testing to see if FAMACHA might be useful for that. And the decision we have to make is two decisions, who to deworm and who not to deworm. Sometimes I tell people who have been deworming all of their animals, for a long time, and they're just not convinced. I say, well, why don't you use the FAMACHA system to find some animals not to deworm? Because research shows that if we'll just leave 10 to 20% of the herd or flock undewormed, that's going to help prevent the dewormers from getting soil resistance. FAMACHA was never meant to be used by itself. So we want to combine it with other criteria. I mentioned the 5-point check. That's looking at 5 points on the animal's body. The eye for the FAMACHA system, the jaw for bottle jaw, the back for body condition scoring, the tail to see if it has diarrhea, and the nose for nasal blots. That helps us make decisions. If you'll notice, the FAMACHA score 3, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 3 has a question mark. And so these additional criteria can help us make decisions when we're not sure whether or not that animal needs to be dewormed. I mentioned using performance as a deworming criteria, average daily gain. A lot of research in different parts of the world are looking at this. They've mostly looked at it in areas where non-barber pole worms are the primary problem, like Australia, New Zealand, England. They've looked at that. They've also looked at it with cattle. Milk production, they've done work showing that you should focus your deworming on the high-producing dairy female because she's under production stress. Same thing with the number of offspring, where you focus deworming on the ewe with 3, or in this case, the doe with 3, that's nursing 3 or more offspring. No need to deworm an animal with 1 offspring. Justin mentioned that you have to get trained in order to use the FAMACHA system. I'm going to differ a little bit with him in saying that you need to get the card. The system is very color oriented. I seriously doubt all of our fingernails are the same color. There's problems if you copy the card off the internet. You need to take the training and get the card. We now offer online FAMACHA certification. University of Rhode Island's been offering it for about 5 years. When COVID hit, several other universities, including my own, started offering the online FAMACHA certification. Basically, you watch a video or a webinar, you take a test, you pass the test, you make a video demonstrating proper FAMACHA scoring technique, you send the video to us. If you meet the criteria, then you can get a card. The technique for FAMACHA scoring is very important. And again, Justin went through that. You cover the eye, you push down on it slightly. We call it cover, push, and we pull on that lower eyelid. So cover, push, pull, and then it pops out. And so the technique is very important. There's a number of videos online that will demonstrate that technique. So FAMACHA is a very important skill to have, particularly if you're in a part of the state where worms are a big problem. Okay, body condition scoring. He talked about that as well. I think body condition scoring probably is almost the most important skill you need to have. We use it to manage reproduction. We use it to evaluate our feeding or grazing program. We use it to evaluate health. Again, it's part of the 5-point check on parasites. And we can use it to determine market readiness. He indicated we use a scale of 1 through 5. These pictures kind of show you what 1 through 5 would look like on most of the goats are clipped. We want to maintain those conditions. I always have it in yellow, 2, 3, and 4. We don't really definitely don't want those extremes. How do we use it to manage reproduction? Well, we know, like most things in life, too much and too little is a problem. So we don't want animals that are either too thin or too fat. And so we should have goals for different parts of the reproductive cycle. So pre-breeding and pre-kidding, we'd like them to be about 3 to 3.5. You might tolerate less in a more of a pasture or range situation where the animals are out year round. And weaning, we expect some loss, obviously, of body condition after and especially if she's got multiples. But you can see the graph here, they have more problems when you get to those extremes. The body condition improves the success of kidding, but then we can reach a point where we have excessive body condition. I mentioned that we use it to assess health and that it's part of the 5-point check. It's also a pretty reliable indicator of internal parasites in adult animals. We would never just look at body condition score in a young animal as an indicator of parasites, but it can be a pretty useful indicator in adult animals. Again, these pictures show you one that's too thin, one that's about right, and the one on the right looks like she's getting pretty fat. Animals in low body condition, regardless of the exposure to parasites, they're simply more susceptible to not only parasites, but other diseases. But we also have problems at the other end, particularly on the reproductive side. Fat does are more prone to pregnancy toxemia. Those that are carrying excess body condition, which if a goat has a lot of fat on the outside, it's got a lot of fat on the inside, because remember, they fatten from inside out. We're going to have more kidding problems, more dystocia. So we want to, again, keep off of those extremes. Last thing I want to talk about is nutrition, because nutrition is the foundation of happy, healthy, productive goats. Maybe it's the same with humans as well. And so I want to talk about each of these concepts. Goats should be fed mostly forage diets. So forage encompasses a lot of different kinds of feed, from our traditional pasture and browse to hay, green chop, grazing a crop field after it's been harvested, haylage, baleage, silage, all different things. But certain byproduct feeds, they're not so much forage, but they can be high in roughage, some of the hull type products. So forage should be the majority of the goat's diet, regardless of whether they're on pasture or in a pen feeding situation. We're going to have less problems with our goats when they are on forage diets. In a bare minimum, goats need a certain amount of long stem forage, what we call effective fiber when we talk about dairy cattle, for rumen function and health. When we don't have sufficient forage, again, that's one of the contributing factors to things like urinary calculi. I think it's one of the limiting factors. A lot of our show animals, I don't think, get enough forage or roughage in their diet. Sometimes, because forage tends to be a low or moderate source of nutrients, some of the nutrients that our animals need are deficient in forage diets, and we may need to supplement them, whether that's a hay diet or a pasture and range diet. The most limiting nutrient is normally energy, and the forage diet is most likely to be deficient in our highest producing animals, so our lactating does and our growing kids. And certainly it's more likely to be deficient in breeds that have a greater potential for growth. For example, dairy goats have very high nutritional requirements relative to other breeds. Boars have higher nutritional requirements compared to the more landrace breeds like Spanish. The need for mineral supplementation varies by region and by farm. I'll give you a perfect example. You know, we consider copper to be taboo on sheep farms, right? Well, my farm happens to be marginally low in copper and marginally high in molybdenum. So I have a special need for copper on my farm. So one way you can save money, particularly as your farm gets bigger, is to find out what your specific mineral needs might be. One of the most expensive ingredients in minerals is phosphorus. And when we feed a complete mineral mix, we're feeding a lot of phosphorus. So, you know, fine tuning a mineral program might pinpoint what you need more, but also help you reduce costs. Generally speaking, we recommend that you feed loose minerals as opposed to blocks. Teeth of sheep and goats are not as well suited to blocks as cattle, nor are their tongues. Feed balanced diets. What an animal needs to eat depends on its sex, its age, its breed, and its stage and level of production. It looks like I repeated the idea that energy is most likely to be deficient, not protein, but energy. Typically, we balance rations for energy, protein, calcium, and phosphorus. Salt is also a pretty important macro mineral, but we actually tend to balance, like I said, for calcium and phosphorus. There are tools for ration balancing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them. And in terms of minerals and vitamins, if your animals are in a feeding situation, then it's best to put those minerals and vitamins into the feed ration so that you know that they're consuming them. When we're talking about grazing animals, we're typically going to offer those minerals free choice. And again, if you can only supplement what you actually need, because maybe you're not supplementing what you really need, and maybe you're supplementing what you don't need. So if you can fine tune that program. Ideally, you want to test your feeds to be certain of what you're feeding. We can use book values for things like corn and soybean meal. They don't differ very much, but forages vary significantly in quality and should be tested. You know, byproduct feeds, something like soy hulls, they also vary in quality and should be testing. And a lot of byproduct feeds should be tested for things like minerals, because sometimes they can throw a ration out of kilter because they're just different and they have differing levels of these minerals. If you're feeding something that's just not typical, then I would test it. You know, can I feed this? Well, test it, see what it's going to contribute to the ration. Maybe you need to limit it, or maybe it's too expensive, or maybe it's a really inexpensive feed, but you won't figure that out unless you test it. Forage or feed testing is inexpensive and can easily pay for itself. There are cost consequences with both under and overfeeding. Underfeeding animals, you know, we look at that as animal abuse in some cases, but I can tell you overfeeding can be just as bad. So we want to be there right where we need to be. We can test, obviously, pasture plants as well. We can test our pastures. We do that fairly consistently in our research program. The important thing to do if you test fresh forages is to watch your animals eat, to make sure you're testing what they eat, not what you think they should eat. This is particularly true with goats. You really gotta observe what they eat, so you make sure your forage test is accurate. But even then, it's not 100% accurate because you don't know what they're eating. So what you can do is you can analyze their feces. And we did this in our buck test in the last few years. And what the analysis of the feces will do is it'll tell you the quality of diet that the goats are eating. And when we did that, what we learned was the goats were consuming a diet that was deficient in energy. So we began a energy supplementation program as part of our buck test. Use scales. If you want to feed animals properly, you need to weigh the feed and you need to weigh the animals. A goat needs so many pounds or ounces or grams of a nutrient per day. He doesn't need 16% protein. He needs so much protein per day. The percentages are used to help us balance rations, because obviously each feed stuff contains a certain percentage or density of nutrients. I have it as an example, you know, what are the percent nutrients in corn, and that shows you what it is. And then we'd multiply it by the amount of that feed to figure out if we're getting enough in the animal. So they need so much per day. And how much they need per day, one of the factors that determines that is how big the goat is. Obviously, if you're raising Nigerian dwarfs versus boar goats versus even big dairy goats, they're all going to need different amounts of feed just to maintain their body functions. Okay, so you need to know at least about what your animals weigh. Ideally, you have a scale. If you don't, you can do measurements. We call them weigh tapes. They sell them at some of the online places, but all you need is a tape that would allow you to measure the length of the goat and the circumference of its heart girth. And there's a formula down there. It's a really old formula. We're trying to find what the exact source of it is, but it's basically heart girth times length divided by 300. Is it going to be 100% accurate? Probably not. How accurate is it? Again, we're trying to find the source of that, but that's going to get you in the ballpark better than guessing and not knowing. And that can help you make sure you're feeding your animals properly. Don't be afraid to ask for help. If you don't know how to feed your goats, get help. Don't ask Facebook. Don't go on a Facebook group and say, hey, what should I feed my goats? No, don't do that. University specialists and county agents can help you balance rations for your goats. A nutritionist at a feed mill can help you balance rations for goats. You can go the software route. Iowa State University has a software program, a relatively new one that can be used to balance rations for goats. I think they have it for all the different classes of goats. It's about $100, which it can easily save that money over years. Langston University has an online nutrient calculator for balancing goat rations. It's free. It just takes you through a variety of questions and helps you arrive at it's very intuitive. It's very practical. You know, it determines the requirements of the goat and then asks you what kind of feeds you have and how much you're going to feed him. And then it works pretty well, and it's free. It even has a weight calculator in there, so that it has formulas for calculating the weight of goats, and it has it divided out by breeds or genetic type. It even narrows it down to how much % boar is in a goat and uses a different formula. I've developed a spreadsheet where you can evaluate what you're feeding. I call it a ration evaluator. So you put the feeds in that you have, you look up the requirements for the goat, and then you put how much you're going to feed, and you kind of by trial and error can see what you should be feeding. So those can be some ways to balance rations. But the first step is, again, everything's based on weight of the feed and weight of the goat. So you need those to do that. Okay, body condition scoring. Again, I think this is the most important thing we need to do. And this is particularly important for nutrition, because again, we want to maintain our goats between 2 and 4. Okay, preferably on the, not 4 and preferably not 2, but between those two things. We want to set and achieve targeted body condition scores: breeding, kidding, weaning for our does, and for our kids, growing and marketing. We want to make sure that they achieve those body condition score goals. If I've got kids out on pasture that are a body condition score 1.5, I'm probably looking at a parasite problem or a nutrition problem. So body condition scoring can help me get at that. Now, after telling you to balance rations, I understand that most of us don't do that. Most people don't balance rations. They might if something goes wrong, but they don't tend to balance rations. So I think that makes body condition scoring even more important. Because again, when the animals are too thin or too fat, you can back up and say, hey, maybe I'm feeding too much or I'm feeding too little. And so body condition scoring is a great tool for that. We also don't typically balance pasture diets. They do in New Zealand, because you can balance a pasture diet just like you can balance a diet that you feed in the feed bucket, but we don't typically. So body condition scoring, again, can help us monitor our grazing program. So again, when animals are too thin, it's either a parasite or a nutrition problem. And when our animals are too thin, let's assuming we've addressed the parasite problem, then our body condition scoring may tell us that I need to supplement that forage diet. We learned in our buck test that we needed to supplement because of the testing that we did on the feces, but I can tell you that there were a lot of body condition scores in there that would probably indicate that too. So on pasture diets in particular, we need to make sure we don't want nor get fatter animals on pasture. We tend to get that in the feed pen, but we need to make sure we have a certain degree of body condition to maintain efficient growth as well as health. So body condition scoring, very important, and probably the most important thing that you need to learn. And Justin certainly emphasized that as well. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't talk too long. I know I bounced around a little bit, but I was trying to think of things where I wouldn't repeat necessarily what Justin said, but also maybe find an angle that was important to discuss. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Susan. If Chris has any questions in the chat room.
Can you hear me on here?
Yeah.
All right. I had to change devices here. I I do not have anything. Doesn't look like showing up in the chat box just yet.
Does anyone want to just ask something? We got time for about one question. Well, if not, thank you, Susan. Appreciate it. We're going to